Hello and welcome to our morning edition of Arirang News. We begin with these stories making the headlines at this hour. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he has instructed Israel to begin peace talks with Lebanon, but added there is no ceasefire and that strikes on Hezbollah will continue. This comes after Israeli strikes on Wednesday killed at least 300 people in Lebanon and wounded more than 1,000 others. Iran's supreme leader said in a statement attributed to him and read out on state TV that the management of the Strait of Hormuz will enter a new phase. His comments come as ship traffic through the key waterway remains heavily disrupted, despite a temporary ceasefire. The South Korean government has decided to keep its fuel price caps unchanged for the next 2 weeks. Announcing a third round of price cap measures on fuel, the Trade Ministry cited ongoing volatility in the Middle East and a fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran. We begin this morning in the Middle East. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ordered peace talks with Lebanon, following recent strikes that killed more than 300 people. U.S. President Donald Trump says he's optimistic that Israel will exercise restraint amid the U.S. negotiations with Iran. Our Kim Do-yeon starts us off.
While the 2-week ceasefire with Iran holds, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made it clear on Thursday that Lebanon is not part of that deal.
I want to tell you there is no ceasefire in Lebanon. We are continuing to strike Hezbollah with force, and we will not stop until we restore your security. Last night, I instructed the cabinet to open direct negotiations with Lebanon in order to achieve 2 goals. 1, the disarmament of Hezbollah. 2, a historic, sustainable peace agreement between Israel and Lebanon.
The announcement follows the deadliest day of the renewed conflict. The Lebanese Health Ministry reports that Israeli airstrikes on Wednesday killed more than 300 people and wounded over 1,100 others. The fighting in Lebanon remains an obstacle to a fragile 2-week ceasefire between the United States and Iran, which was reached earlier this week. End-of-war negotiations between Washington and Tehran are scheduled to begin this Saturday, April 11th in Islamabad, led by U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance and Iranian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf. In a phone interview with U.S. broadcaster NBC on Thursday, U.S. President Donald Trump said he is very optimistic about the upcoming talks. Trump told the network that Iranian leaders are being far more reasonable in private, stating they are agreeing to terms because their military has been conquered. However, the broader truce is teetering. Iran is still severely restricting commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, arguing that Israel's continued strikes on Hezbollah violate the core conditions of the ceasefire. Addressing this variable during his Thursday interview, President Trump stated that Israel is scaling back its operations in Lebanon. He confirmed that he recently spoke with Netanyahu by phone, telling NBC that the Israeli leader will exercise restraint to facilitate the broader negotiation process. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
Iran's supreme leader says the management of the Strait of Hormuz will enter a new phase, signaling tighter control over one of the world's most crucial oil choke points. The warning comes as ship traffic through the strait plunged to under 10% of normal levels, and attacks on Saudi energy facilities further strain global supply. Our Lee Seung-jae has more.
Iran's supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, has signaled tighter control over the Strait of Hormuz, raising concerns about new costs and further disruption to global oil flows. In a statement attributed to Khamenei, read out on Iranian state television, marking 40 days since the death of his father on Thursday, Khamenei said Iran would elevate its management of the strait to a new dimension. His remarks have fueled fears that Tehran could impose a transit fee of up to $2 million per vessel. Khamenei also declared a decisive victory over the United States and Israel, while emphasizing Iran does not seek war, but will respond as a unified force with its regional allies. Meanwhile, ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz remains severely disrupted despite a temporary ceasefire, operating at less than 10% of normal levels. Just 7 vessels passed through in the past 24 hours, compared to about 140 on a typical day before the conflict. Hundreds of tankers remain stranded in the Gulf, contributing to a roughly 20% cut in global oil supply in what analysts describe as an unprecedented disruption. Attacks on Saudi energy infrastructure have also reduced output by about 600,000 barrels per day and cut pipeline flows by another 700,000 barrels per day. Saudi officials say multiple facilities have been hit, adding further strain to global energy markets. The 2-week ceasefire announced this week appears increasingly fragile as Israel pressed ahead with strikes in Lebanon, and Iran showed little sign of easing its near-total blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, a key route for roughly 1/5 of global energy supplies. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And the South Korean government says it will keep fuel price caps unchanged for the next 2 weeks, citing ongoing volatility in the Middle East and a fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran. According to the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Resources on Thursday, under the current system, maximum prices will remain at 1,934 Korean won, or $1.31 per liter for gasoline, 1,923 won for diesel, and 1,531 for kerosene. The price cap policy, introduced in mid-March, is reviewed every 2 weeks to help stabilize domestic fuel costs. Officials say the decision comes as global gasoline prices have dropped sharply, returning to levels seen 2 weeks ago following the announcement of a temporary ceasefire between Washington and Tehran, despite continued disagreements over its terms. The Bank of Korea has held its benchmark interest rate steady at 2.5%. The decision, the 7th straight freeze, was announced Friday morning as the central bank faces a complex policy dilemma exacerbated by the situation in the Middle East since late February. Rate cuts remain off the table due to renewed inflationary pressures and foreign exchange instability. South Korea's consumer prices rose 2.2% on-year in March, while the Korean won also remains volatile, having weakened to the 1,520 Korean won range against the U.S. dollar recently before rebounding to the 1,481 level. Today's meeting marks Governor Lee Chang-yong's final rate-setting session before his term expires on April 20th. And now for more on what's behind the Bank of Korea's rate decision today, we're joined today by Professor Shin Myung-gyu, Associate Professor of Economics at Yonsei University. Professor Shin, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So this is the 7th time in a row that South Korea's central bank has kept its interest rate steady. What's behind today's decision?
Yeah, the BOK's decision to keep the policy rate unchanged at 2.5% is actually widely expected when considering the current macroeconomic environment. On the one hand, inflationary pressures remain as CPI inflation rate recently came in at about 2.2%, which is slightly above the BOK's target, and there are clear upside risks due to rising oil prices. But at the same time, there are also growing concerns about slowing domestic demand and weaker global economic growth, especially given the uncertainty surrounding the Middle East situation. In particular, the uncertainty regarding the U.S.-Iran war might drag down the global economy further, which can affect the Korean economy as well. So to me, and I think for most of the experts, the BOK seems to be balancing these two opposing risks, containing inflation while avoiding an excessive slowdown in the economy.
Right, and the Korean won came back down against the U.S. dollar after being mostly trapped above the critical 1,500 threshold in recent weeks. Do you expect the Korean won to stay in this range?
The recent appreciation of the Korean won, bring it back to around about 1,371 range, seems to reflect partial easing of the global risk sentiment. Following the ceasefire announcement, financial market volatility has somewhat declined, which has reduced demand for safe haven assets like the US dollar. However, I would be a little bit cautious about expecting a sustained recovery like we have seen last 2 days. For example, the Korean won has already depreciated by around 4% since the conflict began, highlighting how sensitive it is to the global uncertainty. It has been found that when uncertainty rises, whether it comes from the geographical risk or global financial conditions, Korean won tends to weaken due to investors' flight to safety behavior. Given that the underlying risks have not been fully resolved, as we see these days, Korean won could still face depreciation pressure. So while it may stabilize in the short run, I would expect continued volatility rather than a clear strengthening trend.
I see. And to contain fuel prices, the Trade Ministry announced a third round of fuel price caps yesterday and says it'll keep them unchanged for the next 2 weeks. So why is the government sticking with the current level? And has this cap on domestic fuel actually helped bring prices down?
Yeah, let me first note that the full price cap, the current policy, seems to have had the kind of the meaningful short-term impact in stabilizing domestic fuel prices. For example, if we look at the data, the diesel prices in Europe surged by more than 30% recently, but the increase in Korea was limited to around 8%, suggesting that this policy has been somewhat effective in containing price spikes. This has also helped moderate inflation to some extent. Even the overall inflation rate rose to about 2.2% in March, as I commented earlier. The increase could have been higher without the stabilization measures. So there are the underlying factors why the government, these are the underlying factors why the government wants to keep the full price caps. However, we also need to notice that there are some limitations in these policies. The policy does not address the underlying supply constraints, which is not the control of the current government. And as we have already seen some signs that prices can rise again because the situation in the Middle East does not seem to stabilize very recently. So overall, I would say the price cap is effective in the short run, but it cannot be the long-term solution.
Right, exactly. And like you mentioned, oil prices fell after the 2-week ceasefire was announced. Do you think they'll stay low? Because some analysts say it could take a year for prices to return to pre-Iran war levels, even if a ceasefire continues to hold. What's your take on this?
Yeah, I also agree with that kind of the idea. But the recent decline in oil prices following the ceasefire announcement reflects the improved expectations about global supply conditions. Investors are likely pricing in the possibility that energy shipments from the Persian Gulf will resume, which reduce the immediate concerns about supply disruptions. However, I would emphasize that this reaction is still largely driven by sentiment or expectations of the market participants rather than confirmed changes in the fundamentals. So, in fact, if you look at the data, oil prices have previously surged by more than 50% since the conflict began, which shows how sensitive the oil market is to the geopolitical developments. And given that the uncertainty about how stable the ceasefire will be, there is still significant risk that supply disruptions could reemerge. And that's actually what we saw yesterday as Israel attacked Iran again, and it impacted the market again. So while the recent drop in oil prices is kind of understandable, I want to say that it may be somewhat premature to conclude that the other pressure on the oil prices has fully resolved.
I see. All right, Professor Shim, thanks so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
South Korea has signed a deal to export another batch of K9 self-propelled howitzers to Finland. According to the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, a second export contract was signed in Helsinki between the Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency and Finland's Defense Ministry. Under the agreement, Hanwha Aerospace will supply 112 howitzers in a deal worth around $630 million. Finland's decision follows the successful operation of 96 K9 howitzers purchased in 2017. The DAPA said the deal highlights the K9 system's proven mobility and firepower in harsh Nordic conditions. And President Lee Jae-myung on Thursday held the first National Economic Advisory Council meeting of his administration. As expected, the economic fallout from the war in the Middle East topped the agenda. Our Blue House correspondent Song Yoo-jin has the details.
A threat, but also an opportunity. President Lee Jae-myung has again called for turning the challenge posed by the war in the Middle East into a chance to overhaul South Korea's economic structure.
이번 이 위기 국면도 모두가 변화를 받아들일 마음의 자세를 갖게 되기 때문에 실제 국정을 담당하는 우리가 잘 준비하면 또다시 이 국면을 기회로 만들어서 새롭게 도약하는 새로운 시스템을 구축하는 정말 좋은 계기가 될 수 있을 것 같습니다.
Lee made the remarks while chairing his first National Economic Advisory Council meeting at the Blue House on Thursday. Established in 1999, the council advises the president on economic policy. Lee and council members focused on what they see as two urgent tasks: securing energy supplies in the short term and reducing South Korea's long-term dependence on fossil fuels and on Middle Eastern energy routes.
We need to secure as much energy supply as possible during the two-week ceasefire. Oil tankers should be deployed as soon as the Strait of Hormuz reopens. We also need to urgently secure crude oil and LNG from sources such as Russia and Iran, and bring in as much naphtha as possible from countries like China and Russia.
On speeding up the transition to renewable energy, the council stressed the importance of building technological competitiveness.
In the case of wind power, advanced countries are already developing and commercializing turbines of more than 15 megawatts. South Korea is still at around 8 megawatts. When it comes to utility-scale renewable energy, I believe offshore wind is one of the very few realistic options for this country.
President Lee returned to the same message later in the day at a weekly meeting with his top aides, reiterating the need to prepare for what he called a, quote, completely different world once the war ends.
The Blue House says the government will move to revise and develop related policies based on ideas discussed at Thursday's meeting. Song Yoo-jin, Arirang News.
Following their comeback show at Gwanghwamun Square last month, BTS have now launched their Arirang World Tour in Goyang, marking their long-awaited return as a full group after nearly 4 years. Our culture correspondent Cho Young-in was there.
Rain poured quite heavily throughout the day, but fans continued to gather outside Goyang Stadium. Ahead of the opening show of the BTS World Tour Arirang, the atmosphere was electric. Many fans took part in various on-site events and activities from the morning, while waiting for the show to begin. Despite the weather, some have been waiting for hours, helping to build anticipation by waving light sticks, taking pictures, and singing along to their favorite BTS songs.
We have waited too long for this. She waited almost 10 years, I waited 9 years, so it's been a long wait, and we're finally seeing.
I'm currently waiting for Swim, and we got the album and everything at home, and hopefully I get to see JK up close, you know. I wasn't able to see him back in Seoul. I was in front of a screen.
The fans haven't just been waiting for hours, but for 4 years as the group returns as a full lineup following their comeback event at Gwanghwamun Square. More than 120,000 fans are expected over the 3-day run in Goyang, following concerts on Saturday and Sunday this week. Goyang also holds significance as the hometown of leader RM. Earlier in the day, the city lit up the concert venue and nearby parks in BTS's signature purple. The concert features a 360-degree open stage, marking one of the largest productions in K-pop. The tour will continue through 2027, spanning 85 shows across 34 cities worldwide. while 46 concerts across Goyang, Tokyo, and major cities in North America and Europe have already sold out. About 2.4 million tickets have been sold for 41 shows in North America and Europe alone. Additional dates in Latin America for October have been announced on Wednesday, expanding the scale of the global tour. With their recent success on the Billboard charts, BTS are expected to draw even greater global attention with this tour. 조영은, Arirang News, Goyang.
Good morning, I'm Chu Ji-hyun, and this is The World Now. Russian President Vladimir Putin on Thursday announced a 32-hour ceasefire in Ukraine over Orthodox Easter weekend, and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy said Kyiv will honor it. The Kremlin ordered Russian forces to halt all military action starting Saturday, April 12th at 4 p.m., running through the end of Sunday, the day Orthodox Christians in Russia and Ukraine celebrate Easter. Ukraine's defense minister directed the military to stand down troops in all directions for the duration of the ceasefire. Zelenskyy, posting on Telegram, said Ukraine had pushed for an Easter pause for more than a week and called the ceasefire a real chance for Moscow to step back from attacks even after the holiday ends. The announcement echoes a similar 30-hour ceasefire last Easter, which both sides accused each other of violating almost immediately. U.S. First Lady Melania Trump stepped before cameras at the White House on Thursday to deny any connection to convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. She called years of online speculation linking her to Epstein, quote, lies that must end today, and demanded Congress hold public hearings for Epstein's victims. Melania stated she met Donald Trump at a New York party in 1998, not through Epstein, and that she first crossed paths with Epstein only in 2000 at an event she attended with her husband. She said at that time she had no knowledge of his criminal activity whatsoever. The statement comes after the Justice Department released Epstein files that included a 2002 email Melania sent to Epstein associate Ghislaine Maxwell, which she described Thursday as nothing more than casual correspondence. 40 days after U.S. and Israeli strikes killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei at his Tehran residence, Iranians took to the streets across the country on Thursday to commemorate his death. The memorials began at precisely 9:40 in the morning, the exact time of the attack on February 28th that killed Khamenei, members of his family, and several senior Iranian officials. The new Supreme Leader, Khamenei's son Mojtaba, who was reportedly injured in the same attack, did not attend any of the events. An Israeli court announced on Thursday that Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's long-running corruption trial will resume this Sunday. Netanyahu faces charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, charges he has denied. The trial began in 2020, carries potential prison time, and has no end date in sight. It is the first time in Israeli history that a sitting prime minister has faced criminal charges. President Trump has publicly echoed Netanyahu's calls for Israel's President Isaac Herzog to issue a pardon to Netanyahu, citing the burden that regular court appearances place on a wartime leader.
It was rainy all day on Thursday and was quite intense for a spring day. Rain has tapered off, but there could be some lingering rain through the morning with around 5 millimeters in the forecast. However, eastern parts of Gangwon-do and Gyeonggi-do province may see rain into the late afternoon, and elsewhere inland a brief passing shower is still possible later in the day. Temperatures have cooled down in this afternoon. Highs will stay lower than season norms again for Seoul, getting up to 14 degrees, Daegu 19 degrees Celsius. Busan getting up to 21 degrees under sunny skies there. Looking ahead, mostly sunny skies and warmer temperatures return this weekend, but Jeollanam-do province and Jeju Island could see rain on Sunday afternoon. Next week looks a lot more promising. Temperatures will stay above 20 degrees Celsius with breezy mornings under brighter skies.
That's all we have for this morning. Arirang News will be back at noon Korea time. Thanks for watching.